I am Ethan, 26 years old. On the exact day I was set to finally graduate from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Standing in the dark, suffocating shadows of the staging tunnel beneath the auditorium, my father texted me to let me know that I was completely cut off and entirely on my own in this world. While I was standing in that poorly lit concrete hallway, drowning in a cheap, $47 rented graduation gown that scratched the back of my neck, smelling old industrial carpet and the nervous, collective sweat of 300 other students preparing to walk the stage, my parents were sitting in the front row seats. The very front row seats that I had personally paid for. My dad looked down at his smartphone, typed out a message with his thick, callous thumbs, and hit send. It read, "Don't expect any help from me going forward. You're on your own." He then looked up toward the staging area, found the camera feeding the live monitor, and smiled. He was practically laughing at my supposed financial ruin in front of 2,000 people. But there was something he didn't know. Something that was about to turn his entire arrogant reality completely upside down. Right there in my pocket, my phone was vibrating with another notification. It wasn't more family drama. It was a message from my chief financial officer, confirming that our tech company's initial public offering had just gone live on the stock market. I wasn't the broke, desperate, begging college kid he thought I was. I was already a billionaire tech CEO, and very soon, he would be staring at the financial news on his screen in absolute, blood-draining horror. Before I tell you exactly how the look on his face changed my life forever, hit that like button if you believe that the best revenge against toxic family members is massive, undeniable success. And don't forget to let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Now, let's go back to where this nightmare actually started. And trust me, it is a journey. The staging tunnel beneath the Kresge Auditorium at MIT is not a glamorous place. It is a long, dimly lit corridor that smells permanently like damp cinder blocks, stale coffee, and the intense anxiety of exhausted 20-somethings who haven't slept properly in 4 years. I was shifting my weight in stiff dress shoes that were aggressively digging into my heels. The black fabric of my robe was heavy and unbreathable, clinging to my back in the stifling heat. All around me, my classmates were buzzing with chaotic energy. They were adjusting their square caps, practicing their handshakes with imaginary deans, and waving frantically at their families up in the bleachers. They were texting their parents, taking selfies, vibrating with the kind of pure, unadulterated joy that comes from knowing you have a safety net waiting to catch you when you walk out those doors. My family was out there too. They had flown into Boston from New Jersey the night before. My father, George Thompson, a third-generation commercial builder and a man of concrete, steel, and unshakable, terrifying arrogance, was sitting in seat C7, right in the middle of the front row. Beside him sat my mother, Eleanor, wearing her usual polite, perfectly painted smile and her expensive pearls. It was the exact same passive smile she had used for decades to smooth over every cruel, dismissive thing my father ever did to me. I had orchestrated their entire weekend. I had handled every single logistical detail with the ruthless precision I applied to running my company. I paid for their first-class flights out of Newark. I booked their luxury suite at the Charles Hotel, ensuring they had the river view my mother liked. I secured the dinner reservation at a high-end, impossibly exclusive seafood restaurant in the Seaport District for later that evening. I did it all silently, slipping my black titanium corporate credit card to concierges and maitre d's, ensuring my parents experienced nothing but absolute perfection. I wanted them there. I needed them there, because for 6 long, agonizing years, I had been an absolute ghost to them. I had swallowed my pride, buried my deep resentment, and played the part of the struggling, naive son just to survive the psychological warfare my father waged. I wanted them to see me holding that degree. Then my phone buzzed in my pocket. It was a harsh, sharp, sustained vibration against my leg. I pulled it out, assuming it was a logistical update from the restaurant confirming our private table, or maybe a quick text from a friend congratulating me on making it to the finish line. Instead, my father's name lit up the harsh blue screen. I stared at the display, the brightness stinging my tired eyes. Below his contact name were 11 words that hit me like a physical punch to the sternum. Don't expect any help from me going forward. You're on your own. I read it twice. Then I read it a third time, the letters blurring together, trying to make sure the dimly lit tunnel wasn't playing tricks on my eyes. The graduate standing next to me, a tall guy from the mechanical engineering department whose name I couldn't even remember, bumped my shoulder and leaned in. He asked if I was all right. I must have made a sound. Something involuntary. Something that scraped its way up from the very bottom of my throat, like a wounded animal. Fine, I said, my voice eerily calm, devoid of any inflection. I'm perfectly fine. My hands were not shaking. I want to be very precise about that for anyone listening who has ever dealt with a narcissistic parent. Over the past 6 years, I had built an internal emotional architecture so rigid, so cold and unyielding, that a lesser version of me would have shattered right there on the thin industrial carpet. I had learned how to hold myself together in boardrooms with ruthless billionaires, in windowless basement offices at 3 in the morning, and in the face of absolute soul-crushing rejection. A text message from a man who never bothered to understand me was not going to break me. But behind my ribs, in the space where my heart was beating a frantic rhythm, something had gone completely, terrifyingly quiet. The last shred of hope I had that he might finally respect me just evaporated into the damp air. I looked up at the live feed monitor mounted on the cinderblock wall of the tunnel. The camera was panning slowly over the front rows of the massive auditorium. I scanned the sea of faces, the proud parents and crying grandparents, until I found seat C7. My father was looking directly at the camera lens, aiming a smug, deeply satisfied smile right at my invisible presence. It was the smile of a man who thought he had just closed a brutal negotiation. It was the exact look he gave independent contractors right before he slashed their invoices and threatened to bankrupt them. He believed he had finally put me in my place, establishing his ultimate dominance at the exact moment he thought I would be most vulnerable. He thought I was stepping out into the real world with a useless piece of paper and completely empty pockets. He thought he was shutting a massive iron door on a beggar. He thought he was teaching me a harsh lesson about how the real world operates. I slipped my phone back into my pocket, the cold metal casing pressing against my thigh. To understand the profound gravity of that text message, and the absolute devastation that was about to rain down on his life in just a few minutes, you need to understand the man sitting in seat C7. You need to know what it cost me to survive his shadow, and the digital empire I had to build in complete, suffocating darkness just to earn the right to exist in his presence. You need to understand the history of the Thompson family, a history built on poured concrete, blatant favoritism, and the absolute refusal to see anything that couldn't be bought and sold in the physical world. Growing up in the Thompson household in an affluent suburb of New Jersey meant understanding one fundamental, unbreakable rule. Human value was measured strictly in things you could hit with a hammer. If it wasn't heavy, if it didn't cast a shadow, it wasn't real. My father owned the Thompson Construction Group, a highly profitable mid-sized firm that paved massive concrete strip malls, erected sterile municipal buildings, and poured thousands of tons of foundation across the eastern seaboard. He was a man of tangible things. He came home smelling of diesel fuel, sweat, and cheap cigars. He spoke about commercial real estate, heavy machinery, profit margins, and crushing union contracts with the kind of religious reverence most people reserve for Sunday Mass. I had 2 older brothers, Mark and David. By the time I was born, the family mythology was already entirely carved in stone, and there was no room for me to write my own story. Mark and David were handed heavy leather tool belts when they were 5 years old. They spent their high school summers baking in the sun on active job sites, breathing in toxic drywall dust, hauling lumber until their hands bled, and learning to read complex architectural blueprints before they could even read a proper novel. They were the golden boys. Mark especially. He was loud, charismatic, aggressively confident, and possessed my father's exact explosive, unpredictable temper. My father loved my brothers with a suffocating, blinding loyalty that left absolutely no oxygen in the room for anyone else. He bought them brand new trucks when they turned 16. He paid their way out of academic trouble. When Mark went through a vicious, highly publicized divorce a few years back, fighting a nasty, mudslinging custody battle over his 2 kids. My father didn't just hire the most expensive family lawyer in the state. He practically bought the entire law firm. He covered every single legal fee, protected all of Mark's assets through shady offshore trusts, and made sure Mark didn't lose a single dime in alimony to his ex-wife. That was how George Thompson operated. If you were in his inner circle, if you built the things he liked and reflected his own macho image back to him, you were entirely untouchable. You were a god. Then there was me. I didn't care about concrete. I hated the smell of diesel fuel and the deafening, bone-rattling roar of backhoes. I cared about invisible systems. I was writing complex lines of code by the time I was 12 years old, sitting in my bedroom while my brothers were out drinking beer in the woods. When I was 14, I discovered a massive security vulnerability in our local school district's network. I could have changed every grade in the county. Instead, I documented the flaw, wrote a detailed patch, and quietly handed it over to the IT director. To me, code was beautiful. It was a structure far stronger than any physical building my father ever erected, because a flawless digital system could protect millions of people at once from threats they couldn't even see. My father, however, treated my passion like a terminal disease, like an embarrassment he had to hide from his country club friends. Every single year at our lavish Thanksgiving dinners, while carving the turkey with an electric knife, he would launch into his usual tired, booming speech about how nobody in this country builds anything real anymore. He would look right at me across the table, his eyes hard and mocking, and say everyone is just moving fake money around on screens. He pronounced the word app with a sneer, like it was a contagious infection. The defining moment of my life, the brutal catalyst for everything that followed, happened on a rainy Tuesday night when I was exactly 18 years old. I had just received my early acceptance letter to MIT. I was sitting in my bedroom, holding a heavy, spiral-bound 20-page business plan I had spent 6 grueling months researching, refining, and perfecting. It was a comprehensive proposal for a mid-market cybersecurity infrastructure company. I knew the gaping hole in the market. I had the math, the meticulous revenue projections, and the advanced threat modeling to prove it. I walked downstairs, my heart hammering against my ribs, and knocked on the heavy solid oak door of my father's mahogany-paneled study. He was sitting behind his massive desk, the one he inherited from my grandfather, surrounded by framed photos of ugly concrete buildings he had poured. I sat in the leather chair across from him and watched him slide a thick, cream-colored envelope across the polished wood. I knew exactly what it was without opening it. It was a commercial lease agreement. He leaned back in his chair, the leather creaking under his weight, lacing his thick, scarred fingers together. He smiled broadly. He told me that Mark was opening his second high-end car dealership, securing exclusive rights to sell Porsche and Ferrari in the wealthiest county in the state. He told me David was expanding his boutique gym franchise into Connecticut. It was a massive year for the Thompson boys. Then he looked at me. The pride vanished from his eyes instantly, replaced by a gaze so incredibly patronizing it made my skin crawl. He said my brothers were going to need someone smart to handle their books. Someone they could trust completely on the financial side to make sure nobody was skimming off the top. He was offering me a starting salary to be their glorified, subservient accountant. He wanted me to sit in a back office and count the money they made. I didn't touch the envelope. Instead, I reached into my backpack, pulled out my 20-page business plan, and set it squarely on his desk, right on top of his precious lease agreement. I took a deep breath and explained my vision. I told him about the massive vulnerability in corporate networks, about how mid-sized companies were going to be bleeding millions of dollars to ransomware in the coming decade because they couldn't afford enterprise-level security. I asked him for an initial seed investment, not a handout, an investment with a clear equity stake, an amount equivalent to what he paid for Mark's divorce lawyer in a single solitary month. My father didn't even open the binder. He didn't look at a single page. He placed his heavy, calloused hand flat on top of my hard work, silencing it completely. He looked at me with eyes full of devastating pity. "Ethan," he said, using that soft, dangerously calm tone he reserved for dealing with irrational clients or people he deemed utterly pathetic. Tech is a bubble. It's fake. These things come and go. There are 1,000 massive companies doing that computer stuff already. Companies with real resources. You cannot compete. I am offering you a real job. The desk will always be waiting for you at Mark's dealership. But if you walk out that door to chase a childish fantasy, do not expect a single red cent from me. Your college fund will go directly to Mark's new showroom. The inheritance, the family real estate portfolio, everything goes to the boys who build real things. Make your choice. He thought the threat of losing his money would break me. He thought the sheer weight of his financial power would force me to bow my head, take the pathetic salary, and spend the rest of my life auditing my brother's inventory of luxury cars. I stood up. I took my business plan off his desk, shoved it back in my bag, and walked out of the room without saying a word. My mother was standing in the hallway outside the study. She looked away, staring at the baseboards, completely refusing to make eye contact. Her silence was louder and far more painful than his threats. She was choosing his money over her son. I left for Boston 3 months later with nothing but a cheap laptop, a suitcase of clothes, and a heart full of freezing rage. MIT was brutal. I wasn't an elite student with a massive safety net and a trust fund paying for my meals. I was entirely self-funded, grinding through complex engineering courses while drowning in constant, suffocating financial anxiety. There was a terrible stretch during my sophomore year where an administrative reprocessing error left my tuition payment short by $300. I was too proud to call home and beg. I ate nothing but instant ramen for 12 consecutive days. I worked weekend double shifts at a greasy diner in Cambridge, clearing tables and scrubbing floors until my hands cracked and bled from the industrial dish soap. Every Sunday, right around noon, my father would call. It was a ritual of pure psychological warfare. He would spend 20 minutes bragging about Mark selling a customized Lamborghini to a pro athlete, or about David's soaring membership profits. Then, right before hanging up, he would casually ask, "How is the little computer project going, Ethan? Still playing on the screens in your dorm?" I would bite the inside of my cheek until I tasted copper. "It's going fine, Dad. I'm fine." I used his mockery as fuel. I stopped sleeping. I turned my cramped dorm room into a bunker. The anger inside me became a sharp, cold instrument. I was building Data Halo, an adaptive threat detection platform specifically architected to protect the exact mid-market companies my father did business with. But I knew building the code wasn't enough. I needed capital. I needed the world to see it. And that meant stepping out into a storm that almost broke me permanently. The reality of pitching a complex tech startup as an unknown, exhausted 20-year-old is a special kind of agonizing humiliation. You walk into massive glass conference rooms carrying your entire soul, your life's work, in a PowerPoint slide deck, and you watch wealthy, arrogant men check their luxury watches while you speak. I took my prototype to venture capital firms all over Boston. I took 10 meetings in 8 grueling months. Every single one was a brutal rejection. Each no left a different shaped bruise on my psyche. The worst of them, the one that nearly destroyed my spirit entirely, was Richard Vance. Richard was a senior partner at a prominent VC firm located on Boylston Street. He had perfectly styled silver hair, a permanent tan from wintering in Cabo, and an ego that entered the room 5 full minutes before he did. I stood at the head of his massive marble conference table, sweating through my only cheap dress shirt, and spent 40 minutes demonstrating exactly how Data Halo could autonomously identify, isolate, and neutralize a network breach in real time. The code was flawless. It was a work of art. Richard didn't look at the screen once. He spent the entire presentation scrolling through emails on his phone, occasionally sighing loudly to let me know I was boring him. When I finished, he slowly leaned back in his plush chair, adjusted his imported silk tie, and laughed. A dry, scraping, intensely condescending chuckle. "Son," Richard said, sliding my laptop back toward me across the polished table, "do yourself a favor. Your tech is cute, but you have absolutely zero business acumen. You look like a kid who hasn't slept in a week. Go work for someone else for 5 years. Get a real job. Learn the ropes of the industry. Stop wasting my time with these dorm room science fairs. We fund real companies here. I packed my bag in silence. I walked out of his office, took the elevator down to the grand lobby, and pushed through the heavy, revolving doors onto the street. It was pouring rain. Cold, relentless, bone-chilling Boston rain that soaked right through my thin jacket. I made it about 30 feet down the sidewalk before my legs simply stopped working. My knees gave out. I sank down onto the wet concrete, pulled my laptop bag tightly against my chest to protect it from the water, and I cried. I cried for exactly 11 minutes. I cried for the hunger, the sheer physical exhaustion, the utter lack of a safety net, and the terrifying, creeping thought that my father might have been right all along. Then, the tears stopped. A deep, crystalline, terrifying anger took their place. I stood up, water dripping from my hair, walked into a nearby coffee shop, borrowed a pen from the barista, and wrote Richard Vance a handwritten thank you note on a napkin. I thanked him for his valuable time. I promised myself, with every fiber of my being, that he would eventually choke on those words. My luck changed 2 weeks later at a miserable, low-level networking event I almost didn't attend because I had a morning shift at the diner, and drinking cheap tap water in a hotel ballroom seemed like a luxury I couldn't afford. I was standing in the corner when Lena Park walked directly up to me. Lena was a former chief financial officer at a major logistics firm. She wore a sharp, tailored blazer, had eyes that missed absolutely nothing, and spoke with terrifying clinical precision. She didn't bother with small talk. She looked at my cheap plastic name tag. "You're the MIT thesis project. Data Halo," she said. "Your business model is absolute garbage. You are underpricing your enterprise tier by 40%, and your go-to-market strategy is entirely backward. You're going to bankrupt yourself in 6 months." I stared at her, utterly defensive and exhausted. "And you are the person who is going to fix your numbers so your brilliant technology doesn't die in a basement," she replied smoothly. Lena quit her comfortable, high-paying executive job with excellent health insurance exactly 6 weeks later. We rented a windowless former supply closet in Kendall Square. It was barely large enough to fit 2 folding tables. I know it was a closet because the heavy metal shelf brackets were still bolted to the concrete walls. I slept on a cheap foam mat I bought at Walmart and kept folded in the corner next to a mini-fridge. We drank terrible coffee by the pot and waged absolute war against the industry. When we pitched together, investors looked at me when I talked about the technology, and they looked at the wall when Lena dissected the financials. We were an unstoppable two-headed monster. But our ultimate test came in the form of a massive, devastating betrayal. Lena utilized her deep industry connections and secured us a meeting with Victor Sterling, the CEO of North Hath Logistics, a massive shipping conglomerate pulling in $4 billion in annual revenue. They had recently been hammered by a vicious ransomware attack that cost them over $4 million in recovery and resulted in a brutal lawsuit from their compromised vendors. Victor was desperate for a solution, but he was highly skeptical of a 2-person startup operating out of a closet. He gave us a 30-day pilot program on a localized segment of their Baltimore network hub. If we caught a threat, he would sign a multi-million-dollar enterprise contract. If we failed or caused operational downtime, we were dead in the water and permanently blacklisted. We deployed Data Halo. For the first 2 weeks, the network was quiet. Too quiet. I monitored the system logs 20 hours a day, fueled by pure adrenaline and caffeine. Then, on day 18 at 3 in the morning, the system alarms triggered. Someone was trying to exfiltrate massive amounts of highly sensitive client data from the inside. The attack vector was incredibly sophisticated, utilizing authorized credentials but operating with highly anomalous behavioral patterns. It wasn't some external hacker from across the globe in a basement. It was an inside job. I traced the digital footprint in real time. My hands flew across the keyboard as Lena stood behind me, holding her breath, the blue light of the monitors reflecting in her eyes. The system did exactly what I designed it to do. It autonomously isolated the compromised node, locked the credentials, and walled off the massive data payload before a single kilobyte breached the external firewall. I pulled the employee ID attached to the rogue credentials. My blood ran completely cold. It belonged to Greg, the senior network administrator at North Hath Logistics. The very guy Victor Sterling had assigned to oversee our pilot program. Greg had realized our automated software was going to make his bloated, inefficient IT department completely obsolete. He tried to stage a fake data breach, planning to blame it on DataHalo's faulty code to get our contract terminated and save his own skin. He was willing to destroy my company, my life's work, for a paycheck. He didn't realize my code was vastly smarter and infinitely faster than him. The next morning, Lena and I printed the unalterable system logs, drove to the headquarters, and walked them directly into Victor Sterling's plush corner office. We didn't just stop a cyber attack. We exposed a catastrophic internal threat that would have ruined his company. Victor fired Greg on the spot, having armed security escort him out of the building, and threatened him with a massive federal lawsuit. Then, Victor picked up his heavy gold pen and signed the enterprise contract with DataHalo. That single piece of paper changed the trajectory of the universe. The North Hath contract was the massive domino that toppled the rest of the industry. Suddenly, the very same venture capitalists who had ignored my emails and laughed me out of their offices were aggressively trying to book meetings with Lena. Their frantic assistants were calling us non-stop. We didn't accept a single term sheet from anyone who had previously rejected us. We raised our series of funding on our own brutal, uncompromising terms from a firm that had to literally beg for a seat at our table. We immediately moved out of the suffocating Kendall Square supply closet and into a massive, sprawling office space with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Boston Harbor. We bought an imported Italian espresso machine that cost more than my first car. We hired 50 elite engineers, then 100, then 200. By the time I turned 25, we closed our Series B funding round. DataHalo was officially valued at $400 million. My personal net worth skyrocketed into the stratosphere on paper. I had a promotion to official CEO status with a board of directors filled with industry titans. I implemented massive salaries and robust 401k plans for all my employees. I was flying private to meetings in Silicon Valley. I could have bought my father's entire real estate portfolio, his aging construction company, and Mark's flashy luxury car dealerships with a fraction of my equity, and I still would have had enough left over to buy the physical land they sat on. But I never said a single word to my family. Every Sunday, I maintained the agonizing ritual. I picked up my phone. I listened to my father brag endlessly about Mark selling 3 Porsches in 1 week, or about Mark attending HOA meetings in his new gated community. I listened to him talk about David opening a new spin studio. I listened to him complain bitterly about union strikes, the cost of lumber, and how the world was going to hell because nobody wanted to do hard labor anymore. "How is the little computer project, Ethan?" he would ask, his voice dripping with that familiar, casual condescension. "Still playing around on the screens?" "It's fine, Dad. Just plugging away," I would reply, leaning back in my imported leather chair, looking out the windows of my corner office at the Boston skyline. The cognitive dissonance was almost physical. I was living 2 entirely separate lives. I was building a fortress of absolute silence. I knew exactly what would happen the moment I revealed my success to him. My father would immediately attempt to claim it as his own. He would rewrite our entire history. He would tell his golf buddies and his business partners that his tough love is what drove me to succeed. He would somehow twist the narrative to make my empire a reflection of his own greatness. He would say he cut me off to make a man out of me. I refused, with every ounce of my being, to give him that satisfaction. I wanted the reveal to be on a stage so massive, so incredibly undeniable, that he couldn't spin it, minimize it, or take an ounce of credit for it. I wanted him to choke on the realization of what he had thrown away. The perfect opportunity presented itself as my graduation from MIT finally approached. Because I had taken significant time off to build the company and secure our early funding rounds, I was graduating a few years behind my original class. Coincidentally, Lena and our board were finalizing the massive mountain of paperwork for our initial public offering with the SEC. We were going public on the exact same week as the commencement ceremony. I sent the heavy, formal cardstock invitations to my family in New Jersey. I booked their first-class flights. I booked their luxury hotel rooms. I set the stage meticulously down to the final detail. I wanted him in the front row. I wanted him to watch me hold a degree he explicitly told me I would never earn, in a city he thought would chew me up and spit me out. The morning of the graduation, I woke up in my penthouse apartment overlooking the Charles River. Lena called me at 6 a.m. sharp. The stock market was preparing to open. The institutional demand for Data Halo shares was astronomical, far exceeding our wildest projections. We had priced our shares aggressively, and the investment bankers underwriting the deal were predicting an absolute explosion at the opening bell. I put on my cheap, scratchy rented graduation gown over my bespoke tailored suit. I took a black town car to Kresge Auditorium. I walked down into that damp concrete staging tunnel, surrounded by hundreds of anxious students holding on to their crippling student debt and their uncertain futures. I stood in the dark, breathing in the stale air, waiting for my name to be called. And that brings us right back to the text message. Don't expect any help from me going forward. You're on your own. I stood in the tunnel, gripping my phone until my knuckles turned white. The sheer audacity of his timing was a masterclass in psychological abuse. He couldn't stand the idea of celebrating me without reminding me of his ultimate financial supremacy. He had to make sure I felt incredibly small, isolated, and dependent before I walked out into the light. He wanted me to step onto that stage feeling like a failure. I looked at the live feed monitor on the wall again. He was still smiling in seat C7, completely unaware that the ground beneath his feet was about to crack wide open. My phone buzzed again in my hand. It was Lena. I answered it, pressing the speaker tight against my ear over the rising noise of the staging area. Ethan, her voice was shaking. Lena Park, the woman with absolute ice in her veins, the woman who never flinched during brutal board meetings, was trembling. I could hear a roaring sound in the background, like a stadium of people screaming. It was the trading floor. "Tell me the number, Lena," I said, my voice eerily calm, the anger inside me suddenly distilling into pure, cold focus. I thought the worst part of my life was finally over. I thought the anger in my chest would finally dissipate. I was so incredibly wrong. The real storm hadn't even begun, and my father was sitting directly in the path of the hurricane. "Tell me the exact number, Lena," I demanded, my voice cutting sharply through the chaotic, echoing noise of the concrete staging tunnel beneath the Massachusetts Institute of Technology auditorium. I pressed the phone so incredibly hard against my ear that the hard plastic edge physically dug into my skin, leaving a dull ache, but I did not care about the discomfort. I needed to hear the absolute reality of what we had built over the last 6 years of blood, sweat, and endless humiliation. On the other end of the line, hundreds of miles away in a high-rise office building overlooking the harbor, Lena Park took a deep, shuddering breath. I could vividly hear the absolute, unhinged bedlam of the trading floor behind her broadcasting through the television monitors in our newly renovated corporate boardroom. It sounded like a massive, overwhelming tidal wave of human voices, shouting over ringing bells, the frantic clattering of keyboards, and the sheer electric energy of capitalism at its most volatile and unforgiving. This was the distinct sound of Wall Street officially digesting the monster we had built in the absolute shadows. "We priced the initial public offering at $45 a share," Lena said, her voice cracking slightly, completely shedding her usual impenetrable corporate armor that she wore like a second skin. "Ethan, the institutional buyers tore through the initial block in exactly 14 minutes. It was an absolute feeding frenzy. And now the retail market just got hold of it. We are currently trading at $82 a share and climbing so fast the exchange algorithms are genuinely struggling to keep up with the volume. The circuit breakers almost tripped twice in the last 10 minutes. I closed my eyes. The heavy, damp, suffocating air of the graduation tunnel seemed to completely evaporate, replaced by a sudden, rushing clarity that chilled my blood in the best possible way. The market capitalization, Lena? I demanded again, my voice dropping to an intense, focused whisper so the engineering student standing next to me wouldn't hear. Give me the final valuation number right now. $1.3 billion, she whispered back. And then she let out a sound that was half a joyous laugh and half an exhausted soul-deep sob. Ethan, we did it. You are officially a unicorn CEO. The entire board of directors is popping vintage champagne in the main conference room right now. Victor Sterling just called my cell phone a minute ago. He is practically screaming with joy because his early equity stake just quintupled in value. You built a billion-dollar company from a windowless supply closet, and the entire financial world knows it now. I stood there in my cheap, $47 rented graduation gown, letting the monumental reality wash over me in massive, crashing waves. $1.3 billion. My personal equity stake alone made me wealthier than my father, his father, and every single arrogant executive sitting in the dining room of his exclusive New Jersey country club combined. I didn't just beat his precious commercial real estate portfolio. I absolutely obliterated it from existence. I have to go get my diploma now, I said. A genuine, unburdened, completely liberated smile finally breaking across my face for the first time in 6 excruciating years. Go? Lena laughed, the sound bright, fierce, and full of triumph. Go take your victory lap, Ethan. I will see you at headquarters tomorrow morning. We have a massive global empire to run. I hung up the phone and slipped it back into the pocket of my slacks. My fingertips brushed against the cold glass screen, right where my father's cruel, dismissive text message still sat unread in my notification center. Don't expect any help from me going forward. You're on your own. Suddenly, the bizarre, oddly specific timing of his message made perfect, sickening sense. It wasn't just a random act of cruelty on my graduation day. It wasn't just him being his usual arrogant, emotionally stunted self. It was a highly calculated, preemptive strike. It was a psychological trap set by a man who had been fed a steady diet of toxic lies by his own deeply dysfunctional family, and who needed to assert his absolute financial dominance before I could supposedly ask him for a favor. You see, a few weeks prior to graduation, I had received a frantic, tearful phone call from Sarah, my older brother Mark's current wife. Sarah was a quiet, highly observant woman, a very reluctant witness to the Thompson family madness. She was terrified of my father's explosive temper and completely exhausted by Mark's endless drama regarding his ex-wife. But she had always possessed a shred of basic human decency that the rest of them entirely lacked. Sarah had locked herself in her master bathroom to call me, whispering frantically so Mark wouldn't hear her over the loud volume of the television in the living room. She warned me that my middle brother, David, the self-proclaimed peacemaker of the family, had been running a vicious, calculated smear campaign behind my back for months. David, whose boutique gym franchise was quietly hemorrhaging money and facing a massive, impending lawsuit from a former equipment vendor, desperately needed a distraction to keep my father's dangerous anger directed elsewhere. So David completely fabricated a story out of thin air. He told my father during a Sunday dinner that my little computer project had completely collapsed. He lied and explicitly said I was drowning in 6-figure corporate debt, that I was facing eviction from my apartment, and that the only reason I had invited the family to my MIT graduation in Boston was because I planned to corner my father in the hotel and beg for a massive financial bailout. David claimed I was going to ask for a piece of the family inheritance early just to keep myself out of bankruptcy court and pay for a defense lawyer. David played my father perfectly. He tapped into George Thompson's deepest, most irrational paranoia. The profound, consuming fear of his hard-earned wealth being drained by someone he deemed fundamentally unworthy and weak. My father believed David instantly. He didn't bother to pick up the phone and call me to ask for the truth. He didn't ask for my side of the story or request to see my actual financials. He didn't even do a simple online search, which would have instantly revealed the heavily publicized SEC filings for Data Halo's upcoming IPO. He simply swallowed the lie whole because it perfectly fit his preferred, arrogant narrative. It confirmed his deep-seated bias that the tech industry was a massive scam and that I was a pathetic failure who should have just taken the humiliating, low-level accounting salary at Mark's car dealership when he offered it years ago. So, my father formulated a ruthless, punishing plan. He accepted the expensive, first-class flights I bought him without a single word of gratitude. He slept comfortably in the luxury hotel suite I paid for. He sat proudly in the front-row seat I reserved for him. And he waited patiently until the exact moment I was physically trapped in the staging tunnel, mere minutes away from walking across the stage, to drop the hammer. He sent that text message to cut me off before I could even ask for the imaginary money he thought I desperately wanted. He wanted to humiliate me. He wanted to watch me walk across that stage knowing I was entirely broken, financially destitute, and utterly alone in the world. He was sitting out there in seat C7, armed with his arrogance and his massive checkbook, waiting to watch me bleed out in public. He had absolutely no idea he was sitting at ground zero of a financial nuclear detonation. "Graduates, please prepare to line up," a booming voice echoed through the tunnel. The university commencement coordinator, a highly stressed woman with a heavy clipboard and a headset, began ushering our group forward toward the entrance. I took my place in the long, winding line of black robes. The heavy fabric of the gown felt entirely different now. It didn't feel like a suffocating shroud of academic debt and uncertainty. It felt like a superhero's cape. The nervous anxiety filling the tunnel, the frantic energy of my peers worrying about their entry-level salaries, their upcoming job interviews, and their looming student loan payments, completely washed past me without leaving a mark. I was entirely insulated by the quiet, absolute, unshakable power of my own reality. We began the slow, rhythmic march out of the tunnel. The transition from the dim, damp concrete corridor into the blinding, theatrical lighting of the Kresge Auditorium was physically jarring. The massive room was packed to the absolute rafters. 2,000 people, anxious parents, weeping grandparents, distinguished faculty members, and a local Boston News crew doing a live segment on the graduating class, were packed into the bleachers and floor seats. The ambient noise was deafening, a collective, overwhelming roar of pride, flash photography, and anticipation. I kept my eyes locked straight ahead on the stage as I emerged from the tunnel. I knew exactly where my family was sitting in the front row, but I deliberately didn't look at them yet. I wanted to draw out the moment. I wanted the tension to build until it was almost unbearable. I calculated the exact distance. It was exactly 43 steps from the edge of the staging area to the center of the wooden podium where the university president and the dean of the engineering department were standing. 43 steps. I took the first step, my stiff leather dress shoes clicking sharply against the polished hardwood floor of the stage. With every single step I took, the crushing psychological weight of the past 6 years began to physically lift off my shoulders, evaporating under the bright stage lights. I thought about the freezing winter nights I slept on that cheap foam mat in the windowless Kendall Square supply closet, listening to the heating pipes rattle. I thought about the deeply humiliating meeting with Richard Vance, the arrogant venture capitalist who looked down his nose at me and told me to go get a real job. I thought about the 12 agonizing days of eating nothing but stale instant ramen because my father flatly refused to help me with a minor college fund error. I thought about the endless, torturous Sunday phone calls, biting the inside of my cheek until it bled while my father bragged endlessly about my brother's mediocre achievements and openly mocked my life's work. I was walking across a stage I had almost not made it to. Not because of a lack of intellect, not because of poor grades, but because the sheer, crushing weight of financial poverty and emotional isolation engineered by my own family had nearly broken my spirit completely. I had survived an environment explicitly designed to make me fail and crawl back to them on my hands and knees. As I approached the center of the stage, the dean of engineering stepped up to the massive microphone. He was a distinguished, intimidating man with silver hair and 30 years of tenure at the university. He held my hard-earned diploma in his hand, encased in a beautiful, dark red leather binder stamped with the university seal. He leaned into the microphone, his voice resonating through the hall. "Ethan Thompson, Bachelor of Science in Computer Science and Engineering." My name boomed through the massive auditorium speakers, vibrating deep in my chest cavity. This was it, the moment of absolute, undeniable convergence. The cruel trap my father had so carefully set for me was about to violently snap shut on his own neck. I reached out and grasped the heavy leather binder. I shook the dean's hand firmly. His grip was strong, his smile warm and genuinely proud. "Congratulations on everything, Mr. Thompson. We expect great things from you," he murmured over the applause. "Thank you, sir," I replied, my voice steady and incredibly calm. "You have no idea." I turned away from the dean, the diploma held firmly in my left hand, and I finally allowed my gaze to drop down from the rafters to the front row. I scanned the faces until I looked directly at seat C7. I thought the worst part of the storm was over when the market opened. I was so incredibly wrong. The true devastation, the absolute, catastrophic collapse of my father's reality, was happening right in front of my eyes, and it was the most magnificent, terrifying thing I had ever witnessed in my entire life. The human face is a fascinating, brutally honest canvas when it experiences a catastrophic, world-altering paradigm shift. When I finally locked eyes with my father from the center of that brilliantly lit academic stage, he was not looking up at me with a smirk. He was looking straight down at his smartphone, the exact same expensive device he had used to send his cruel, cowardly text message severing our ties just 15 minutes prior. I could see the entire scene unfolding in agonizingly beautiful, crystal-clear slow motion. My father, George Thompson, the hardened man of steel and concrete, the ruthless patriarch who successfully controlled his entire family through constant financial fear, threats of cutting off the inheritance, and relentless intimidation, was staring frozen at a push notification on his screen. I found out later from Sarah exactly what he saw in that moment. Being a paranoid businessman who obsessively monitored the financial markets to protect his real estate portfolio, he had the Bloomberg and Wall Street Journal applications configured to send breaking, high-priority market news directly to his lock screen with a loud audible alert. Right at the exact, poetic moment the dean called my name to the crowd, a major financial alert had pushed through to millions of devices worldwide. The notification headline read, "Data Halo IPO explodes on opening day. 26-year-old founder Ethan Thompson mints tech unicorn status at $1.3 billion valuation." I stood perfectly still and watched the exact millisecond the information fully processed in his aging brain. His face, normally flushed with the ruddy, aggressive arrogance of a man who spent his entire life barking orders on golf courses and active construction sites, went completely, starkly white. It wasn't just a pale shock. It was the translucent, gray color of a man who was actively having a massive cardiac event. All the blood instantly evacuated from his cheeks, leaving his skin looking like wet ash. His jaw physically dropped open, falling slightly slack as his breathing hitched in his throat. He stared intensely at the glowing screen, his eyes wide with a mixture of profound confusion and mounting terror, and then his eyes darted violently up to the stage. He looked directly at me, standing tall and holding the diploma. He looked at the massive digital banner glowing above my head that read Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Then he looked frantically back down at his phone, his thick, calloused fingers visibly trembling as he fumbled to unlock the screen to read the full, detailed financial article. He was doing the math in real time, the brutal, undeniable, crushing arithmetic of the moment. His youngest son's name was currently booming through the auditorium speakers. His youngest son's face was broadcast on the giant monitors above the stage. And his youngest son's name was currently dominating the global financial news on the device shaking in his hands, explicitly attached to a staggering number with a comma and 2 zeros that he would never, ever see in his entire lifetime of pouring concrete. Sitting directly beside him, my mother, Eleanor, was clapping politely, a soft, generalized, vacuous smile plastered on her face. She was completely oblivious to the nuclear bomb that had just detonated next to her. She was dabbing her eyes with a lace tissue, moved by the general pomp and circumstance of the ceremony, completely unaware that the tectonic plates of her marriage, her financial security, and her family's entire power dynamic had just violently and permanently ruptured. I stood in the absolute center of the stage, the flashing strobe bulbs of the local news photographers and proud parents illuminating the massive room, and I looked directly, piercingly into my father's terrified, widening eyes. I didn't scowl. I didn't look angry. I didn't look vindictive or bitter. I simply smiled. I gave him the exact same smug, closed mouth, utterly satisfied predatory smile he had aimed at the camera when he thought he had completely ruined my life in the tunnel. I fed his own toxic arrogance right back to him, magnified by $1 billion of undeniable, cold, hard leverage. I saw the expression land like a physical blow to his chest. I saw the violent physical recoil in his broad shoulders. He sank back heavily into his chair. He understood immediately. He knew that I knew. He realized in a sickening rush that the son he had threatened to disinherit, the son whose carefully saved college fund he had spitefully given to Mark's car dealership, the son he had openly mocked for 6 excruciating years, had entirely, flawlessly orchestrated this exact moment. He realized he was sitting in a front-row seat I had purchased with unlimited corporate money, in a city I had completely conquered without his help. The arrogant man who had explicitly refused to give me a single dollar for a seed investment, who had offered me a humiliating, low-wage salary to be a bookkeeper, was now painfully, acutely aware that I could easily buy his entire construction company, fire him, and turn his headquarters into a parking lot for my junior employees if I felt like it. I turned my back on him, walked calmly across the rest of the stage, descended the wooden stairs, and disappeared into the cheering crowd of graduates. People always ask me what happened at the celebratory dinner that night. When you watch movies or read dramatic books about confronting toxic families, you always expect a massive, explosive screaming match. You expect flipped dining tables, thrown wine glasses, and a dramatic, tear-filled monologue where the protagonist airs every single painful grievance in a crowded public restaurant while bystanders gasp in shock. But real power doesn't need to shout. Real, absolute power is completely, chillingly, terrifyingly quiet. I had made a reservation months in advance at Ona, an ultra-exclusive, ridiculously expensive seafood restaurant in the Seaport District. It was a place where elite hedge fund managers, powerful politicians, and tech billionaires dined to seal deals. A place where a single bottle of imported wine cost significantly more than my mother's monthly mortgage payment. We sat at a private, dimly lit corner table overlooking the dark, rolling water of the harbor. The atmosphere at the table was so incredibly thick with unspoken tension you could have cut it with a serrated steak knife. My father was a complete shell of a man. The booming, dominant, aggressive patriarch was entirely gone, replaced by someone who looked physically shrunken and aged inside his expensive tailored suit. He didn't mention the cruel text message he had sent me in the tunnel. He didn't mention the IPO. He didn't mention the staggering fact that my net worth was now public knowledge and trending on every major social media platform. He was completely, utterly paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of his own catastrophic miscalculation. Instead of addressing the massive billion-dollar elephant in the room that was currently crushing the oxygen out of his lungs, he desperately tried to force a sense of normalcy. It was honestly pathetic to watch. He picked up his heavy silver fork, took a small bite of his pan-seared Chilean sea bass, and started talking, loudly and far too rapidly, about Mark's miserable life. So, Mark finally finalized the custody agreement with the lawyer last week. My father blustered, staring fixedly at his expensive plate, absolutely refusing to lift his head and meet my eyes. Cost an absolute fortune in legal fees, let me tell you, but the kids are safe with him. And his new showroom is pulling in incredible retail numbers. We're actually looking at acquiring a new piece of commercial real estate off the main highway to handle the overflow inventory. The zoning laws are a nightmare, but I know the mayor. He was desperately clinging to his old, rusty weapons. He was trying to reassert his dominance by reminding me of the real business world, the world of concrete, cars, lawsuits, and political favors, the tangible things he understood. He was trying to pretend that my massive digital empire didn't exist, hoping if he ignored it, the reality would magically go away. My mother, finally sensing the unnatural, vibrating terror radiating from her husband, nervously chimed in, talking rapidly about the upcoming landscaping committee vote at their local HOA, and how the neighbors were complaining about the oak trees. I didn't say a single word. I just sat there in my bespoke suit, slowly eating my perfectly cooked meal, perfectly composed, watching them perform their desperate, transparent little play. I let the silence stretch out, heavy, dark, and suffocating. Every time my father paused for breath, expecting me to jump in, the silence crushed him a little more. He was terrified. He was waiting for me to gloat. He was waiting for me to viciously attack him so he could immediately play the victim, so he could jump up and call me an ungrateful, arrogant kid who forgot where he came from. I denied him that emotional release. I gave him absolutely nothing to work with. At the end of the excruciating meal, the waiter approached our table with silent professionalism, holding the heavy leather folio containing the final bill. The total was easily over $2,000. Before the waiter could even set it down on the table, my father reached frantically for his wallet, his movements jerky, clumsy, and panicked. He desperately needed to pay. He needed to assert his traditional role as the financial provider. He needed to prove to himself that he was still the boss of the table. "I've got it, George," he muttered, using the third person to pump himself up, pulling out his shiny platinum credit card with a shaking hand. I reached out across the table and placed my hand firmly over his wrist. I didn't grip it hard, but the implied, immovable strength was absolute. He froze instantly, his eyes finally darting up to meet mine. "Put your wallet away, Dad," I said, my voice smooth, quiet, and completely devoid of emotion. I smoothly withdrew a heavy, solid black titanium corporate card from my jacket pocket. A card with absolutely no spending limit, bearing the sleek silver logo of Data Halo, and handed it directly to the waiting waiter. The waiter nodded respectfully, completely ignoring my father's card, and walked away. My father stared blankly at the empty space on the white tablecloth where the bill had been. His hand slowly, defeatedly retreated to his lap. His face did something highly complicated. It was the tortured expression of a proud man who was trying to formulate an apology, but completely lacked the basic emotional vocabulary to do so because he had never authentically apologized a single day in his entire life. "Ethan," he started, his voice cracking, sounding incredibly small. "I didn't know." "Didn't know what exactly?" I asked calmly, picking up my glass and taking a slow sip of my sparkling water. "I didn't know what you were building. I didn't know it was this big, this real." I set my glass down with a soft clink. I looked at him, really looked at him. I looked past the arrogant builder, past the toxic patriarch, and saw exactly what he was. A small, deeply frightened man who was terrified of a changing world he couldn't control. "Yes, you did, Dad," I said quietly, leaning forward slightly across the table, invading his space. "I put the entire comprehensive business plan on your desk 8 years ago. I gave you the math. I gave you the market projections. I showed you the exact threat models. You knew exactly what I was building." He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing, completely unable to look away from my stare. "You just didn't believe it was real because you couldn't hit it with a hammer?" I continued, my voice entirely devoid of anger, which I think scared him more than anything else in the world. "You chose David's pathetic lies over my reality. You chose to protect Mark's messy divorce instead of funding my future. You made your choices, and you made them very clearly." The waiter returned and handed me the receipt. I signed it with a quick, practiced flourish, leaving a massive tip that probably equaled my father's weekly grocery budget, and stood up from the table. I picked up my tailored suit jacket. "The private black car is waiting outside at the curb to take you back to the hotel," I said, looking down at my parents from my full height. "Your flights home tomorrow are fully paid for. Have a safe trip back to New Jersey." I turned and walked out of the restaurant, leaving them sitting alone in the suffocating silence of their own making. I didn't look back. I stepped out into the cool, crisp Boston night air, the streetlights reflecting beautifully off the dark water of the harbor. For the first time in my entire life, my lungs felt completely clear. The heavy, dark shadow of George Thompson was permanently gone. The public fallout was spectacular, exceptionally swift, and entirely out of my hands. I didn't have to lift a single finger to destroy my father's reputation. The undeniable truth did the heavy lifting for me. Exactly 11 days after the IPO went live and the market stabilized, the Wall Street Journal published a massive, highly anticipated weekend feature piece on the incredible rise of Data Halo. The prominent journalist assigned to the story, an incredible, relentless woman named Olivia Chan, had spent hours interviewing Lena and me in our new headquarters. The bold headline on the front page of the business section read, "The Billion-Dollar Ghost: How Ethan Thompson Built a Global Tech Empire in Complete Silence." Olivia didn't pull any punches in her reporting. She meticulously outlined the brilliance of our adaptive threat detection platform, detailed our massive, game-changing enterprise contract with Victor Sterling, and painted a brutal, honest picture of our early days sleeping on foam mats in a Kendall Square supply closet. But the specific section of the article that truly set my family's world on fire was paragraph 6. Olivia wrote, "Unlike many of his affluent Silicon Valley peers who lean heavily on established family wealth, trust funds, and generational safety nets to launch their startups, Thompson built his unicorn entirely self-funded from the ground up. Multiple sources confirm he received absolutely zero financial backing from his family's lucrative, multi-million-dollar real estate and commercial construction empire. Instead, the young CEO worked grueling double shifts at a local Cambridge diner to survive, eating instant noodles while writing the complex code that would eventually revolutionize mid-market cybersecurity. When asked about his family's contribution, Thompson declined to comment, stating only that his success was a completely independent venture. She didn't explicitly name my father in the text. She didn't need to. In the tight-knit, gossip-heavy, hyper-competitive world of New Jersey country clubs and commercial real estate developers, absolutely everyone knew exactly who George Thompson was. They knew how he bragged endlessly and obnoxiously about Mark's car dealerships and David's gyms. And now, thanks to the most respected financial publication in the country, they knew he had completely, blindly missed out on the biggest financial success his family line would ever see in 10 lifetimes. The public humiliation for a raging narcissist is a fate infinitely worse than death. My father's carefully constructed, decades-long image of the all-knowing, omnipotent patriarch shattered literally overnight. His wealthy golf buddies, the men he constantly tried to impress with his building contracts, were suddenly cornering him in the locker room, asking him with barely concealed amusement why he didn't invest a few $1,000s in his own son's massive company. He had to sit in the clubhouse lounge, gripping his expensive scotch until his knuckles turned white, and try to desperately explain how a man who prided himself on spotting lucrative investments had completely ignored a billion-dollar tech unicorn sitting right at his own dining room table. He became a cautionary tale, a laughingstock among his peers. The internal dynamic with my brothers imploded just as quickly and violently. Mark, the golden child, suddenly looked completely pathetic. His high-end car dealership, which my father had generously funded using the money meant for my college fund, was pulling in decent revenue, but it was absolute pocket change compared to my liquid equity. The sudden, horrifying realization that I could literally buy his entire luxury inventory with cash, fire him, and crush him economically drove Mark into a deep, toxic spiral of bitter, raging jealousy. He stopped talking to my father entirely, blaming him for not forcing me to share the wealth. And David, the manipulative mastermind who had spun the malicious web of lies about my imaginary lawsuit and my massive debt to save his own skin, he was entirely excommunicated by my father. George Thompson desperately needed someone to blame for his catastrophic miscalculation, and David was the absolute perfect scapegoat. In a fit of rage, my father completely cut off David's emergency funding for his failing gym franchise. Without the constant bailouts, David lost 2 locations to bankruptcy within 6 short months and was forced to move into a tiny apartment. The desperate, transparent attempts to crawl back into my good graces began almost immediately. My phone started lighting up constantly with pathetic messages from people who had previously treated me like absolute garbage. The most satisfying one by far came via a direct message on LinkedIn. It was from Richard Vance, the arrogant, silver-haired venture capitalist who had laughed in my face, refused to look at my pitch deck, and told me to get a real job. His desperate message read, "Ethan, incredible news on the IPO. I saw the Wall Street Journal piece. I always knew you had incredible grit even back then. Our firm is currently putting together a massive secondary growth fund, and I'd absolutely love to buy you a steak dinner at Capitol Grill and explore some strategic synergies. Let's reconnect and do some business." I sat at my desk and looked at the message, vividly remembering the freezing feeling of the Boston rain soaking through my cheap clothes as I sat crying on the concrete outside his Boylston Street office. I clicked on his profile, hit the block button without a second thought, and closed the application. Some people don't even deserve the dignity of a response. They just deserve to watch you win massively from the cheap seats in the bleachers. Then, inevitably, came the text message from my father. It arrived on a quiet Sunday afternoon, right around the exact time he used to call me just to mock my little computer project. It read, "Read the journal article. Proud of you, son. Let's get lunch when you are back in Jersey. We have a lot to catch up on." 3 words. Proud of you. I stared at the glowing screen, sitting in my massive corner office on the 22nd floor, looking out over the sprawling Boston skyline. 10 years ago, when I was a desperate teenager seeking his approval, those 3 words would have moved me to tears. I would have done absolutely anything, compromised any core part of myself, just to hear him say them. I would have handed him a controlling stake in my company on a silver platter just to finally feel the warmth of his validation. But sitting there now, a self-made billionaire, I felt absolutely nothing. The words were completely hollow, echoing with intense insincerity. They weren't driven by genuine love, regret, or fatherly pride. They were driven entirely by proximity to massive power. He wasn't proud of Ethan the son. He was deeply impressed by Ethan the billionaire CEO who was on the cover of the Wall Street Journal. He wanted access. He wanted to tell his country club friends that he and I were close, that he advised me on the IPO. He wanted to bask in the warm, golden glow of the exact wealth he had tried so hard to deny me. I picked up my phone and typed my reply. I didn't ignore him, which would have given him a reason to play the victim, and I didn't start a screaming fight. I simply established a permanent, impenetrable professional boundary. I texted back, "Thank you, Dad. I am incredibly busy with the European expansion right now, so lunch won't be possible anytime soon. I'll have my executive assistant send something nice for Mom's birthday next month. Take care." I hit send. I treated him exactly how he had treated me for years. Like a minor, slightly annoying business associate who simply wasn't important enough to warrant a spot on my busy calendar. I denied him the one single thing a true narcissist craves far more than money, which is emotional supply. I didn't give him my anger, and I certainly didn't give him my forgiveness. I just gave him my utter, polite, devastatingly professional indifference. That was exactly 3 years ago. Today, Data Halo is a massive, unstoppable global operation. We employ over 800 brilliant people across 3 different continents. We recently acquired a smaller, highly innovative competitor based in Austin, Texas, and our proprietary software currently protects the highly sensitive data of 4 massive Fortune 100 companies. My daily life is filled with intense board meetings, international private flights, and the relentless, thrilling, high-stakes pressure of running a publicly traded technology company. Every time I get a massive promotion or hit a new revenue milestone, I don't seek validation from my blood relatives. Lena Park, my incredible partner, my brilliant CFO, and the only person who believed in me when I had nothing, was recently named one of the most powerful women in global tech finance by Forbes magazine. When the issue hit the stands, I sent a massive, ridiculous arrangement of rare orchids to her corner office with a small, handwritten card that simply read, "Still think my business model is garbage." She immediately texted me back a single word. "Obviously. We are a true family in every sense of the word. A chosen family built on mutual respect, shared trauma, late nights, and the absolute, unwavering refusal to ever accept defeat." As for my biological family, the distance between us is vast, cold, and entirely permanent. I haven't been back to the state of New Jersey for Thanksgiving since the day of my graduation. I do not attend the stuffy country club dinners. I don't answer calls from unfamiliar numbers in their area code, and I absolutely do not engage in the endless, exhausting, toxic drama of Mark's chaotic personal life or David's financial ruins. Honestly, the only time I will probably ever step foot in that town again is for a funeral. I do pay quietly for my mother to go on a luxury cruise twice a year with her friends, because despite her profound cowardice and enabling behavior, I refuse to let her suffer in the miserable environment my father created. But my relationship with my father is permanently reduced to a polite, incredibly tense 10-minute phone call on major holidays. He asks about the company now. He tries to sound knowledgeable. He asks real, probing questions about market trends, stock fluctuations, and international corporate expansion. He certainly doesn't call it a little computer project anymore. But the massive gap between us can never, ever be bridged. The psychological damage he did in that mahogany study when I was an 18-year-old kid begging for his support, and the sheer cruelty he displayed with that text message in the tunnel when I was 26 proved exactly who he is at his core. You can't unsee that kind of betrayal. People ask me all the time when I give keynote speeches at tech conferences and Ivy League business school seminars what the ultimate secret to my success was. They always want to know the specific coding language I used, or the viral marketing strategy Lena deployed, or the exact legal phrasing I used to close the massive North Half logistics deal. They want a blueprint. But the truth is much darker, much more painful, and much more personal than any business metrics or profit margins. The real secret was the absolute, crushing, terrifying pressure of a closed door. When my father slid that commercial lease agreement across his polished desk and aggressively threatened to take away my inheritance, my college fund, and my entire family safety net, he genuinely thought he was destroying my options. He thought he was forcing my hand and breaking my spirit. He intended that text message in the staging tunnel to be the final, devastating nail in the coffin of my self-worth. Don't expect any help. You're on your own. He was right. I was completely on my own. But he severely, catastrophically underestimated what a desperate, intelligent person is capable of when they have absolutely nothing left to lose and everything in the world to prove. To anyone listening to this story right now who is currently suffocating under the heavy, unbearable weight of a toxic family dynamic. To anyone who is constantly being told by their parents or siblings that their dreams are childish, that they aren't smart enough, or that they are the problem child simply because they refuse to conform to a sick, dysfunctional system. Hear me right now and hear me clearly. You do not need their money. You do not need their conditional love. You do not need their validation. And you absolutely do not need to fight for a seat at a table where you are constantly being served disrespect and humiliation. The greatest inheritance you can ever possibly receive from a toxic parent is the stark realization that you have to build your own empire from scratch. The anger you feel right now, the sheer, burning, agonizing injustice of being constantly overlooked, mocked, and minimized by the exact people who are supposed to protect and nurture you. Do not let it destroy you. Do not let it turn you bitter and small. Harness it. Let it sharpen your focus until it cuts through solid glass. Use it as fuel to stay up later, work harder, and build something so massive, so incredibly, undeniably real, that they are permanently forced to stand in its shadow. When you finally walk across your own stage, whatever that looks like for you in your life, and you look down at the people who tried their hardest to break you, do not scream. Do not beg for their apology. Do not ask for their understanding. Just smile, knowing that you survived them, and then turn your back, walk away, and step into the brilliant, beautiful, peaceful life you built with your own two hands. Have you ever faced something similar with your own family? Have you ever had to cut ties to save yourself, or build your success in complete silence? Share your story in the comments below, and don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss the next journey.